Why did my grandfather, the most meticulous man I had ever known, leave his entire empire to the two people he trusted the least? That question echoed in the oppressive silence of the conference room, a sterile beige box on the 27th floor of a skyscraper that felt more like a tomb than an office. It was the question that would unravel my entire life. I sat apart from them, a small island of worn tweed in a sea of tailored black silk and simmering greed. My family, the Vances. They were gathered like vultures waiting for a will reading, which was precisely what it was. My grandfather, Arthur Peterson, the man who had built Peterson Logistics from a single rusty truck into a national behemoth, was gone, and the final moves of his long, intricate game of chess were about to be played. My cousin Caleb Vance was the heir apparent. At 30, he had his father's ambition and none of his patience. He exuded an aura of smug certainty, adjusting the cuffs of his $1,000 shirt as if he were already sitting in the chairman's seat. He leaned over to his sister Chloe and whispered something that made her stifle a giggle. Chloe, at 27, was a masterpiece of cosmetic enhancement and brand name worship. She looked bored endlessly, scrolling through her phone, probably cataloging the ways she would spend her impending fortune. Her disinterest was a performance. Beneath it, her eyes darted towards the lawyer's briefcase with a hawk's intensity. Their father, my uncle Richard Vance, sat at the head of the table, a statue of forced solemnity. He had been my grandfather's right-hand man for 40 years, and in his mind, today was simply the official transfer of power. His gaze was heavy, calculating, sweeping over the room as if it were already his dominion. And then there was me, Liam Carter, the 28-year-old history teacher, the family footnote. The quiet, bookish son of Arthur's other daughter, my late mother, who had committed the unforgivable sin of marrying for love instead of strategic advantage. I didn't belong here, and the cold shoulders of my relatives made that abundantly clear. In my hand I clutched a small, worn wooden king, a chess piece my grandfather had given me years ago. Its smooth, familiar shape was my only anchor in this suffocating room. I wasn't here for the money. I was here to say a final goodbye to the only person in my family who had ever bothered to see me as more than a disappointment. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies with a face made of dry parchment, finally cleared his throat. The rustle of papers sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. Chloe's phone vanished into her purse. Caleb sat up straighter, his feigned patience evaporating. Richard leaned forward, almost imperceptibly. The show was beginning, Mr. Davies began to read in a monotone voice that belied the earth-shattering sums he was announcing. To my grandson Caleb Vance, he began, I bequeath a controlling interest in Peterson Logistics effective immediately. Caleb's chest puffed out. He shot me a triumphant smirk across the table, an unspoken, I told you so, that stung more than any insult. Richard gave his son a curt approving nod. The kingdom had been passed down. Furthermore, Mr. Davies continued, the company headquarters, all associated properties, and the contents therein are transferred to his name. Chloe was next. To my granddaughter, Chloe Vance, I bequeath the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue and a trust fund in the amount of $5 million. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped Chloe's lips before she masked it with a delicate cough. $5 million. It was more money than I could ever imagine earning in 10 lifetimes. She was already mentally redecorating the penthouse, I was sure of it. The lawyer paused, shuffling his papers. The main assets had been distributed. The Vances were already looking at each other, their minds buzzing with their new fortunes. They had forgotten I was even there. Mr. Davies looked up, his gaze finally settling on me, tinged with something that looked like pity. It made my skin crawl. And finally, he said, his voice softening slightly, to my grandson Liam Carter. Caleb leaned back in his chair, a bored, arrogant expression on his face. He was likely expecting me to get some sentimental trinket, a dusty set of books, maybe enough money to fix the perpetually failing transmission on my 10-year-old car. Mr. Davies picked up a thin-aged envelope from the table. Mr. Peterson has left you this. He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany. It seemed so insignificant, so flimsy compared to the thick stacks of deeds and stock certificates my cousins had just inherited. Caleb let out a short, barking laugh. It was a sound of pure derision. Chloe giggled along with him, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. Uncle Richard simply shook his head, a look of weary confirmation on his face. The oddball grandson got an old letter. It was exactly as he'd expected. My hands felt numb as I reached for the envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's familiar spidery script. I could feel all their eyes on me, watching, waiting for my reaction. I carefully broke the seal. My heart was pounding, not with anticipation, but with a growing sense of humiliation. Inside, there was no letter. There was only a single plane ticket, a one-way flight to Florence, Italy. Tucked behind it was a small folded piece of notepaper. I unfolded it. On it, 4 numbers were written in the same ink as my name. 1952. That was it. A plane ticket and a mystery number. The silence in the room was broken again by Caleb's laughter, louder this time, unrestrained. A vacation? He boomed, slapping the table. The old man sent the history teacher on a field trip. How fitting. I stared at the ticket, the destinations printed in crisp, clear letters. It felt like a joke. A cruel parting joke at my expense. Why would he do this? Why, after all our conversations, all our games of chess where he taught me to think 10 moves ahead, would he leave me with this meaningless puzzle? Caleb stood up, the new king of the castle, and walked around the table to where I sat. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip just a little too tight. "Enjoy your trip, Teach," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should go see some of those ruins. It'll suit your expertise. While you're gone, I'll be busy running the actual legacy he cared about." He squeezed my shoulder one last time before striding out of the room, Chloe and Richard following in his wake like a royal procession. I was left alone in the silent, empty room with a plane ticket to a place I'd never been, a 4-digit number that meant nothing to me, and the stinging question that started it all. Why? Why would the wisest man I knew make a move that made absolutely no sense at all? I didn't know it then, but the answer wasn't in that room. It was waiting for me an ocean away in a city built on secrets and rebirth. My grandfather hadn't left me a joke. He had left me the opening move to a whole new game. The heavy oak door of the conference room clicked shut behind me, and the sound seemed to sever the last thread connecting me to that world of wealth and power. The transition was jarring. One moment I was in a sterile, air-conditioned room smelling of expensive leather and ambition. The next I was stepping out of the rattling elevator into the humid chaos of the city street. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and the angry blare of horns, a soundtrack that perfectly matched the turmoil in my own head. My apartment, when I finally got there, felt different. It was my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom space crammed with more books than furniture, usually a place of quiet comfort. But tonight, the familiar scent of old paper and dust felt like the smell of failure. The towering stacks of history books, my life's passions, suddenly seemed like monuments to a life spent looking backward while the rest of my family was rocketing forward. I dropped my keys on the small entryway table and slumped into the worn armchair that had been my mother's. The plane ticket and the small piece of paper with 1952 written on it felt alien on my coffee table, a glossy promise of a world I had no access to, placed next to a stack of unpaid bills. I flipped open my laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the room with a cold blue light. The numbers on my banking app were stark and unforgiving. Checking account $1,047.32. A bright red notification from my landlord's portal was impossible to ignore. Rent payment overdue. The rent was $1,000. $1,000 I desperately needed, which was currently masquerading as a one-way ticket to Italy. My mind raced, running through the logical, responsible options. I could sell the ticket. A flight to Florence, even one way, had to be worth a few $100s. It would be enough to appease my landlord, to buy groceries, to fix the brakes on my car. It was the smart thing to do. The sane thing to do. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to list it online, to convert this ridiculous, insulting inheritance into something useful. But then my eyes fell on the worn wooden king I had placed beside the ticket. I picked it up, its familiar weight settling into my palm. Closing my eyes, I wasn't in my cramped apartment anymore. I was 12 years old again, sitting across from my grandfather in the sunroom of his sprawling house. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, glinting off the polished board between us. I was losing, as I always did. I had moved my queen into what I thought was a brilliant, aggressive position, only to realize I had left my king exposed. He saw the flicker of panic in my eyes. He didn't capture my king. Instead, he leaned back, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Liam," he had said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. You see the board, but you're not seeing the game. The most powerful move is not always the most obvious one. It is the one nobody else sees coming, the one that requires a little bit of faith. He had then pointed out a move with his knight, a quiet, unassuming shift that would not only save my king but would trap his queen 3 moves later. I opened my eyes. The memory was so vivid I could almost smell the lemon tea he always drank. He was a meticulous planner, a master strategist in business and in life. He never made a move without considering every possible outcome. Leaving me a plane ticket wasn't a joke, it wasn't an insult. It was a move on the board, a quiet, unassuming move that I couldn't yet understand. He was asking me to have a little bit of faith. With a deep breath, I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over my contacts before I pressed the one name I knew I could call. My mom answered on the second ring. I explained everything to her, the sterile meeting, Caleb's smug face, the penthouse, the millions, and then the envelope. I told her about the ticket, the number, the utter confusion I felt. She was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I don't know what he was planning, honey," she admitted. "Your grandfather kept many secrets even from me. He built a wall around his business life, but I know one thing. I know he loved you. He saw so much of your grandmother in you, the same quiet strength, the same passion for things that have nothing to do with money. He never did anything without a reason, Liam, you know that. Maybe you should trust him. One last time." We talked for a few more minutes, her calm voice a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. We hung up, and for the first time all day, a sliver of clarity cut through my despair. She was right. He had a reason. He always had a reason. My finger was tracing the outline of the ticket when my phone buzzed violently on the table, startling me. The caller ID flashed a name that made my stomach clench: Caleb Vance. Hesitantly, I answered. "Hello. Liam, buddy." Caleb's voice was slick with false bonhomie. I could hear the clinking of glasses and faint music in the background. He was celebrating. "Just calling to check in. Wanted to make sure you were doing okay after you know all that. Must have been a bit of a letdown." "I'm fine, Caleb," I said, my voice flat. Good. Listen, I was just thinking," he continued, the condescension practically dripping through the phone. "That trip to Italy sounds great, but it can be expensive. If you're a little short on cash, I'd be happy to, float you a small loan. Consider it a gift from the new head of the family. A few thousand maybe, just to help you get on your feet." A loan. He was offering me a loan. The humiliation from the conference room came flooding back 10 times stronger. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a power play. It was his way of reminding me of my place, the poor charity case, the history teacher who needed a handout from the new king. In that instant, something inside me snapped. The debate was over. The internal conflict vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "That won't be necessary," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Oh, suit yourself," he chuckled. "Well, enjoy the pasta. I've got a board meeting to prepare for." He hung up. I stared at my phone, my knuckles white as I gripped it. A slow, burning anger rose in my chest. This wasn't just about faith in my grandfather anymore. This was about defiance. This was my one chance to make a move that they would never see coming. I turned back to my laptop, the banking page still glowing on the screen. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Airline website, confirm passenger details, seat selection, final payment. My cursor hovered over the confirm purchase button. For a fraction of a second, I hesitated. This was it. This was the point of no return. I would have less than $50 left to my name. It was the most illogical, irresponsible decision of my life. And I had never felt more certain about anything. I clicked the button. The confirmation screen loaded. My bank balance on the other tab instantly updated, the number plummeting into double digits. I had done it. I had just bet everything I had, which was next to nothing, on a dead man's puzzle. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, followed by something I hadn't expected. A strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. The game was on. The next 24 hours passed in a surreal haze. I packed a single suitcase with a few changes of clothes, a handful of books, and the worn wooden king. Leaving the apartment felt final. I took one last look at the stacks of books, the familiar armchair, the life I had built for myself, and closed the door without looking back. The taxi ride to the airport was silent, the city lights smearing across the window like wet paint. Every car that passed felt like it was filled with people living normal, sensible lives. People who weren't flying across the world with less than $50 to their name based on a dead man's whim. A knot of pure anxiety had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. The airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and the low hum of thousands of conversations. It was an ecosystem of hellos and goodbyes, of new beginnings and final ends. I felt completely anonymous, a ghost drifting through the crowd. My flight wasn't for another few hours. The adrenaline that had fueled my defiant ticket purchase had long since burned away, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing hunger. I hadn't eaten since before the will reading a lifetime ago. I found a small cafe nestled between a currency exchange and a bookstore, and stood in line, my stomach rumbling. The menu was overpriced, as all airport food is. I settled on the cheapest options, a bottle of water and a pre-packaged turkey sandwich that looked profoundly sad. At the counter, I handed the cashier my debit card, the same one I had used to drain my account. It was a reflex. She swiped it. A harsh electronic beep cut through the air. She swiped it again, the same jarring sound. She looked at the screen, then at me, her expression a perfect blend of boredom and annoyance. "It's declined," she said, her voice flat. "Do you have another card?" My face flushed with a hot, prickly wave of shame. Every head in the line behind me seemed to turn in my direction. I was that guy, the guy holding up the line because he couldn't afford a $10 sandwich. "Sorry," I mumbled, fumbling for my wallet. "I have cash." I pulled out the crumpled bills. I had left a 20, a 10, and a few ones. I smoothed them out on the counter, my hands trembling slightly. The total was $15.38. I paid with the 20 and received a few dollars and some coins back in change. That was it. That was the entirety of my worldly wealth, a handful of change that wouldn't even be useful in Italy. The cashier slid my water and sandwich across the counter without another word. I grabbed them and scurried away, my cheeks still burning. Finding an empty seat at a deserted gate, I ate the sandwich. It was as tasteless as it looked, but it filled the aching void in my stomach. As I ate, I watched the planes take off and land, colossal metal birds soaring into the unknown. Each one felt like a taunt. They were all going somewhere with a purpose, filled with passengers who had plans, destinations, and enough money in their accounts to buy a sandwich. I was just following a ghost. Finally, my flight was called. Boarding the plane felt like stepping onto a different planet. The air was recycled, the lighting was dim, and everyone was focused on the small personal rituals of travel, stowing bags, finding seats, buckling up. I found my window seat and pressed my face against the cool plexiglass. The ground crew moved like ants below. The terminal, my city, my old life, all of it grew smaller and smaller as the plane ascended until it was just a glittering tapestry of lights against the vast darkness. There was no turning back now. For the first few hours of the flight, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a frantic carousel of what-ifs. What if this was all a mistake? What if I got to Florence and there was nothing there? What if my grandfather had simply gone senile in his old age? I took out the small piece of paper from my wallet. 1952. The numbers stared back at me, offering no clues. I was a history teacher. Numbers and dates were my language. I racked my brain. What happened in 1952? The UK tested its first atomic bomb. The polio vaccine was created. Eisenhower was elected president. None of it seemed to connect to my grandfather. It was a dead end. Another piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve. Exhaustion eventually began to win the war against my anxiety. My eyelids grew heavy, the drone of the engines a hypnotic lullaby. I drifted off into a restless sleep, and in that sleep I dreamed. I was sitting across from my grandfather in his sunroom again. The chessboard was between us, but the pieces were strange, carved from light and shadow. He looked at me, his eyes clear and sharp, just as I remembered them. He didn't speak, but I could hear his voice in my head, as clear as if he were sitting right there. "You are looking at the pieces," Liam, the voice said, echoing his words from so many years ago. "But you are not seeing the game." In the dream, he reached across the board and gently pushed my worn wooden king forward. Sometimes his voice continued, "You must put your most important piece in danger to discover its true power." Then the dream dissolved, the sunroom fading back into the darkness of the airplane cabin. I woke up with a start, the echo of his words still ringing in my ears. I didn't feel scared anymore, just tired, deeply, profoundly tired. I leaned my head back against the seat, closed my eyes, and for the first time I let the plane carry me toward whatever came next. Stepping out of the Florence airport was like stepping into a different world. The air thick with the scents of espresso, diesel, and something ancient and floral was a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the plane. The Italian sun was warmer, casting a golden, almost painterly light on everything it touched. It was overwhelming. The language was a beautiful, rapid-fire melody that I couldn't understand, and for the first time, the sheer magnitude of my impulsive decision crashed down on me. I was utterly and completely alone in a foreign country, a stranger with a handful of American coins and a cryptic 4-digit number. A tide of panic began to rise in my chest as I stood frozen amidst the swirling currents of travelers and taxi drivers, a piece of driftwood in a fast-moving river. My eyes scanned the crowd of people holding signs. Rossi, DeLuca, Smith. I searched for my own name, Carter, with a pathetic sort of hope. A hope that dwindled with each passing face. What had I expected? That my grandfather had arranged a welcoming committee? The whole idea was absurd. I was probably supposed to find my own way to solve some other part of the puzzle, just as I was about to give in to despair and find a quiet corner to figure out my next move. My eyes caught it. Tucked away near a stone pillar, a man stood slightly apart from the main crowd. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a deeply lined face and a full head of thick silver hair. He was holding a simple hand-lettered sign that read, Mr. Carter. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I wasn't stranded. Someone was here. I straightened my shoulders, grabbed the handle of my suitcase, and made my way towards him. As I got closer, I saw that his face was stern, almost severe. His eyes, a dark, intelligent brown, watched my approach without a flicker of welcome. He wasn't a cheerful driver for hire. He looked more like a sentinel, a guardian standing his post. When I finally stopped in front of him, he didn't smile or offer to take my bag. He simply looked me up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that took in my rumpled clothes, my tired eyes, and the anxious uncertainty I was trying so hard to hide. "Mr. Carter," he asked. His English was heavily accented but clear and precise. "Yes," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "That's me, Liam Carter." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, but his expression remained unchanged. He didn't lower the sign. It felt less like a greeting and more like an interrogation. The silence stretched, becoming awkward and heavy. "Mr. Arthur spoke of you," he said finally, his voice a low baritone. "He said you were a skilled chess player." The statement caught me completely off guard. Of all the things I expected, a discussion of my chess hobby was not one of them. "We played a lot," I managed to say. "He taught me." The man's gaze sharpened. "Then you will tell me," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "What was his final move in your final game?" I stared at him, bewildered. A test. He was testing me. My mind, foggy with jet lag and anxiety, struggled to rewind. The last game. It was a few days before he passed away in the hospital. The board was set up on his bedside table. He was weak, but his mind was as sharp as ever. I had him cornered, or so I thought. My pieces were perfectly positioned for an assault on his king. And then he made his move. It was unorthodox, unexpected. It looked like a mistake. I remembered the flicker of confusion I felt, followed by a slow, dawning admiration as I saw the trap he had laid for me. "Bishop to h7, I said, the memory becoming crystal clear. It was a sacrifice. It looked like he was giving up his most powerful attacking piece for nothing, but it forced my king into the open. It was checkmate in 3 moves. For the first time, a change came over the old man's face. The severe lines around his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. He lowered the sign and extended a hand. "My name is Marco," he said. "It is an honor to finally meet you." His handshake was firm, his palm calloused from a life of hard work. The test was over. I had passed. He took my suitcase from my hand with a surprising strength. "Come," he said, turning on his heel. "We have a long drive." I followed him to an old but impeccably maintained black sedan. The interior smelled of aged leather and lemon polish. The drive out of Florence was a dizzying tapestry of ancient stone buildings, bustling piazzas, and swarms of scooters that zipped through traffic with a life of their own. Once we left the city limits, the landscape transformed. The scenery unfolded like a Renaissance painting. Rolling hills carpeted in green, dotted with cypress trees that stood like dark green exclamation points against the bright blue sky. Vineyards stretched for miles, their vines heavy with ripening grapes. It was beautiful, so beautiful it hurt to look at. Marco drove in silence for a long time, his focus entirely on the winding country road. The mystery of the situation was starting to settle in again, deeper this time. Who was this man? And what was his connection to my grandfather? Where were we going? Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. "Marco," I began, my voice hesitant. "Can you tell me what this is all about? I don't understand any of it." He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "Mr. Arthur was a complicated man," he said after a moment. "He lived more than one life." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "The life you knew in America with Peterson Logistics, that was one of them. It was the life he built for his family there. And the other one," I prompted, my heart beginning to pound again. Marco gestured with his chin towards the idyllic landscape outside the window. "This," he said simply. "This was the other one, his first one, his real one." He let the words hang in the air, letting their weight sink in. "He did not come to Italy as a tourist, Mr. Carter. For more than 50 years he considered this place his home, a home that no one in his American family ever knew existed." The car fell silent again, but this time the silence was filled with the deafening roar of 1,000 new questions in my mind. A second home, a second life, the plane ticket, the number, the strange test at the airport. They were not random pieces of a puzzle. They were keys, each one designed to unlock a door to a secret world my grandfather had built, a world I was now driving into, headfirst, completely blind. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the hills. We were heading deeper into the heart of the Tuscan countryside, and deeper into the heart of a mystery that was bigger than I could have ever imagined. The smooth black sedan ate up the miles, carrying me deeper into a landscape that felt less like a real place and more like a dream I had once had. The rolling hills of Tuscany were a living, breathing masterpiece. We passed ancient olive groves, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the late afternoon light, and fields of sunflowers standing tall and proud, their faces turned towards the setting sun. The silence in the car was no longer awkward. It was reverent. I was starting to understand that this drive was part of the story, a deliberate, slow reveal of the world my grandfather had kept hidden. After another 10 minutes, Marco slowed the car and turned off the main road onto a long, winding driveway, lined with towering cypress trees that stood like ancient sentinels guarding a secret kingdom. Gravel crunched under the tires as we approached a magnificent set of wrought iron gates. An ornate R was worked into the design. The gates swung open smoothly and silently, as if they were expecting us. The driveway continued curving gently through perfectly manicured lawns. And then I saw it. It wasn't a house. It was a villa, a sprawling stone edifice that seemed to have grown organically from the very hill it rested on. It was ancient and beautiful, with a low-pitched roof of terracotta tiles that glowed a warm, earthy red in the golden light. Dark green ivy clung to the stone walls like a living tapestry, and pots of vibrant red geraniums lined the windowsills. It was a place of permanence, of history, a place that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. It was the absolute antithesis of my small transient apartment and the disposable, fast-paced world I came from. Marco brought the car to a stop in a cobblestone courtyard centered around a trickling stone fountain. He got out and opened my door with a quiet formality. "Welcome to Villa Rossi," he said, his voice softer than before. I stepped out of the car feeling clumsy and out of place. My travel-worn clothes a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of my surroundings. I was so awestruck that I just stood there staring, trying to absorb the sheer scale and beauty of the place. The air smelled of damp earth lavender and the faint sweet scent of grapes. Marco retrieved my suitcase and gestured towards a massive arched wooden door. "She is waiting for you on the terrace." He led me inside. The air was instantly cool and still, a welcome relief from the afternoon heat. My footsteps echoed softly on the flagstone floors. The interior was just as breathtaking as the exterior, with high-beamed ceilings, antique wooden furniture polished to a deep shine, and large open windows that framed the stunning landscape like living paintings. We walked through a grand living area and out onto a wide stone terrace, and there, sitting at a small table with a view that stretched across the entire vineyard, was a woman. She was turned away from me, looking out at the rows of vines that cascaded down the hillside. Even from behind, she exuded an aura of timeless elegance. She had hair the color of spun silver tied back in a simple, graceful knot. She wore a simple cream-colored linen dress. As we approached, she seemed to sense our presence and turned. My breath caught in my throat. She was beautiful, her face a roadmap of a life well lived with fine lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow. But it was her eyes that stopped my heart. They were my grandfather's eyes. The exact same shade of deep, piercing blue, filled with the same sharp intelligence and a hint of a deep, abiding sadness. "Marco, thank you," she said, her voice a warm, melodic alto with the rich cadence of Italian. "You can leave us." Marco gave a respectful bow of his head and retreated, leaving me alone with this mysterious woman. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Please, Liam, sit down. You must be exhausted after your journey." I sat, my movement stiff and awkward. I felt like a child in the presence of royalty. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice hoarse. "I don't mean to be rude, but I don't understand. Who are you?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "There is no need to apologize. Your confusion is completely understandable." She poured a glass of chilled water from a pitcher on the table and pushed it towards me. "My name is Elena Rossi." The name meant nothing to me. I took a sip of the water, my mind racing. Was she a business partner? An old friend of my grandfather's? Nothing made sense. She seemed to read the questions in my eyes. "Arthur and I met a very long time ago," she began, her gaze drifting back towards the vineyard. "He was a young man then, not much older than you are now. A soldier stationed here just after the war. He fell in love with this land, with the people, with the way of life." She paused, turning her piercing blue eyes back to me. "And he fell in love with me." I just stared at her, my mind refusing to process the words. I don't understand," I stammered. "My grandmother, she passed away years ago." Elena's smile was gentle, tinged with a profound melancholy. "Yes, his American wife. I know. Arthur was a man who lived by a code of honor, but his heart was divided by an ocean. He never abandoned his duties in America. But he never abandoned his life here either." She reached across the table and lightly touched the back of my hand. Her skin was soft, her touch warm. "Liam Arthur Peterson was my husband. We were married here in a small chapel in the village more than 60 years ago. The world tilted on its axis. My grandfather. Married to someone else. It was impossible. He was the most straightforward, honorable man I knew. He wasn't capable of such a deception. The number," I whispered, the thought hitting me like a physical blow. "The paper in the envelope, 1952. "Yes," Elena said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. 1952. It was not a historical event for him to quiz you on. It was the year our history began. It was the year we met." I leaned back in my chair, the solid wood the only thing keeping me from falling. A secret marriage. A secret wife. A secret life. The puzzle pieces were crashing together in my mind, forming a picture I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. I looked out at the endless rows of vines, at the magnificent villa, at this impossibly elegant woman who claimed to be my grandfather's wife. Villa Rossi. I said the name from the gate clicking into place. This place. This was our home. She finished for me, her voice filled with a quiet pride. This was the world we built together. Peterson Logistics was his work, his duty. Villa Rossi. She swept her hand out to encompass the breathtaking view. This was his heart, and now he wanted you to see it. I had another family, an entire branch of my life, of my history that had been a complete secret. The shock was so profound it left no room for any other emotion. I wasn't just a history teacher from America anymore. I was something else, something more, a part of a story that had begun decades before I was born in these sun-drenched Italian hills. And I had a feeling the story was far from over. Elena rose from her chair with a quiet grace, her movement a silent invitation for me to follow. She led me from the terrace back into the cool, still interior of the villa. We didn't go back to the grand living area, but instead turned down a quiet hallway I hadn't noticed before. At the end of the hall was a single heavy wooden door. She pushed it open, and a scent I recognized instantly washed over me, a scent of old books, lemon polish, and the faint sweet aroma of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. It was a smell I associated with home, with safety with him. This was his space. It wasn't an office. There were no filing cabinets, no imposing desks, no cold leather chairs designed to intimidate. It was a study, a place of thought and quiet contemplation. Bookshelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled not with business ledgers, but with volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry in both English and Italian. A comfortable worn leather armchair sat near a large window that overlooked the sprawling vineyard, the setting sun painting the room in hues of orange and gold. On a small inlaid table next to the chair, a marble chessboard was set up, a game frozen mid-thought. I could see the pieces, his familiar carved wooden set, and I knew instantly that the position on the board was the very one from our last game in the hospital. He had preserved it. The sight of it sent a pang of grief so sharp and sudden through my chest that I had to steady myself against the doorframe. This room was a perfect distillation of the man I knew, the man I loved. It felt like he had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. Elena seemed to understand. She gave me a moment, her presence a quiet, comforting anchor in my sea of swirling emotions. Then she walked over to a beautiful antique secretary desk and picked up a slim modern tablet. She held it out to me. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "He wanted you to see this here," she said softly, "in his favorite place on earth." I took the tablet. My hands felt clumsy, my fingers numb. The screen was dark. I tapped it, and it illuminated, showing a single video file on the desktop. The title of the file made my throat tighten. "The Final Move, Grandson." My thumb hovered over the play icon for a long moment. I was afraid. I was afraid of what I would see, of what I would learn. But I also knew that this was the reason I was here. This was the answer to the question that had been haunting me since I first opened that envelope. I took a deep breath and pressed play. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was sitting in the very leather armchair I was now standing beside. He looked frailer than I remembered, the illness having taken a greater toll than I had realized. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes he had passed on to Elena, were a wildfire of intelligence and fierce, unwavering resolve. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me. "Hello, Liam," he began, his voice a familiar, raspy whisper. "If you are watching this, then it means you had faith. You trusted the board. You made the move that no one else would have understood. For that, I am more proud than you will ever know." He paused, a flicker of pain crossing his features before he mastered it. "I owe you an explanation. And I owe you an apology for the deception. But I hope when you understand the whole game, you will find it in your heart to forgive me." He took a sip of water, his hand trembling slightly. "The inheritance," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Let's talk about the inheritance your cousins are so busy celebrating. Peterson Logistics. It was my life's work. I built it from nothing. But for the last 10 years, your Uncle Richard has been running it straight into the ground with his timid decisions and his inability to adapt. And Caleb has been treating the company account like his personal piggy bank. Fast cars, expensive trips, foolish investments. He has the ambition of a king and the judgment of a fool." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into me through the screen. "Liam, the company is bankrupt. It is a hollowed-out shell propped up by a mountain of debt that is about to come crashing down. That penthouse Chloe is so excited about, it's mortgaged to the hilt, a loan I co-signed against the company's assets. That $5 million trust fund, its payout is tied directly to the company's annual profits. There haven't been any real profits in 3 years. It is an empty promise. The world wasn't just tilting anymore. It had inverted completely. I sank into the armchair, the tablet resting in my lap, my mind reeling. A trap. The entire inheritance was a trap. I have watched them for years. My grandfather continued, his voice laced with a profound disappointment. Your uncle, your cousins. They see life as a series of assets to be acquired. They don't see the people who work for the company, the families that depend on it. They see only numbers on a balance sheet. I could not, in good conscience, leave my true legacy in the hands of people who would squander it without a second thought. So I gave them what they valued, a title, the appearance of wealth, the illusion of power. I let them crown themselves king and queen of a house of cards just before the wind was about to blow. He sighed a long, weary sound. But you, Liam, you were different. You never asked me for anything. When you visited, you didn't ask about the stock market. You asked about the Peloponnesian War. You wanted to hear stories about my time in Italy. You looked at that chessboard and you didn't see winning and losing. You saw beauty strategy history. You value the king not for its power but for what it represents. Character, integrity, the heart of the game. He gestured around the room, a sweep of his hand that seemed to encompass the villa, the vineyard, the very land itself. This is the real legacy, Liam. Villa Rossi. Elena and I built this place from nothing but love and hard work. Our wines are respected all over the world. The land is ours. The business is strong, solvent, and free of debt. It is worth 10 times what Peterson Logistics was even in its prime. It is a legacy of passion, not of profit. And it is all yours. Tears were streaming freely down my face, now hot and silent. It wasn't about the money, it was about the trust. The incredible, staggering weight of his trust in me. Elena will guide you, he said, his voice softening. Marco will protect you. You have a family here you never knew, a history that is also yours to claim. What you do with this inheritance is up to you, but I trust you, Liam. I trust you to honor its history, to care for the land, and to lead it into the future. It is a heavy burden, I know. But you have the strongest shoulders in the family, even if you don't know it yet. He looked away from the camera for a moment, out the window towards the setting sun. The game is over now. I have made my final move. He looked back at me, a faint, loving smile on his lips. It's your board now, grandson. Checkmate. The screen went dark. The video was over. I sat there in the silent golden room, the sound of my own ragged breathing loud in my ears. The weight of his words, of his love, of his incredible, intricate plan settled over me. Every insult from Caleb, every dismissive glance from my uncle, every moment I had ever felt like an outsider in my own family was suddenly reframed. It wasn't a punishment for them. It was a reward for me. He had seen me all along. He had always seen me. I looked from the dark screen of the tablet to the chessboard on the table. For the first time, I wasn't just looking at the pieces. I was seeing the entire game. The weeks that followed were like a dream from which I never wanted to wake. The initial shock gave way to a slow, profound sense of belonging. Villa Rossi was not just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was becoming a part of its long and beautiful history. My days fell into a gentle, unfamiliar rhythm, dictated not by the ringing of a school bell, but by the rising and setting of the Tuscan sun. I spent my mornings with Marco, walking through the endless rows of vines. He was a man of few words, but he spoke the language of the land fluently. He taught me how to read the leaves, how to test the soil between my fingers, how to know by the scent on the wind when the grapes were ready for harvest. He was teaching me the heart of the empire my grandfather had built. My afternoons were spent with Elena. She was the soul of the villa. We would sit on the terrace, the same one where she had upended my entire world, and she would tell me stories. She told me about meeting my grandfather, a young American soldier with sad eyes and a brilliant smile. She told me about their struggles buying the land piece by piece, planting the first vines with their own hands. She filled in the 50-year gap in my knowledge, painting a portrait of the man I thought I knew, adding layers of depth and color I could never have imagined. Through her, I learned not just about my grandfather, the husband, and the vintner, but also about myself. I was not just Liam Carter, the forgotten grandson. I was a Rossi. I was a part of this land, this family, this incredible secret legacy. The constant anxiety that had been my lifelong companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence I had never felt before. I was learning to speak Italian, my clumsy attempts met with warm encouragement from the vineyard workers. I was learning the business, a complex and fascinating world of cultivation, production, and distribution. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not for what I could produce or what I could earn, but for who I was. It was on one such perfect afternoon, about 3 weeks after my arrival, that my old world came crashing back into my new one. Elena and I were walking along a high ridge overlooking the valley, the villa, a warm jewel of stone and tile below us. The sun was warm on my skin, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of the vineyard. We were discussing plans for the upcoming harvest when my phone, a relic of my past life that I rarely used anymore, began to buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from my mom. But the name that flashed on the screen made the blood run cold in my veins. Caleb Vance. It was a video call. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Elena saw the change in my expression and placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "It is all right," she said softly. "You are ready." Her words steadied me. I took a breath and accepted the call. Caleb's face filled the screen, and the sight of him was a physical shock. The smug, arrogant cousin I knew was gone. In his place was a haggard, desperate man. His hair was a mess. Dark circles hung like bruises beneath his eyes, and his expensive suit was rumpled as if he had slept in it. But the real horror was the background. He was in the chairman's office, my grandfather's old office, but it was a ghost of its former self. The shelves were bare, the walls were stripped of their art, and the vast room behind him was utterly empty. No assistants, no ringing phones, no hum of a thriving business, just a hollow, echoing silence. "Liam, finally," he barked, his voice raspy. There was no greeting, no pleasantry. "I've been trying to reach you for days. What, you're too busy stomping grapes to answer your phone?" Even in his desperation, the condescension was second nature to him. "I've been busy, Caleb," I said, my voice calm and even. The serene landscape behind me, the rolling green hills and the endless blue sky, was a stark, almost cruel contrast to the barren corporate tomb he was trapped in. He seemed to notice my surroundings for the first time. He squinted at the screen. "Right. Your little trip. Look, I don't have time for games. The company has a bit of a cash flow problem. Some temporary market fluctuations. Nothing serious, but our creditors are getting nervous." He ran a hand through his greasy hair, a gesture of pure stress. "I've been thinking, and I've decided to be the bigger man here. I know we've had our differences, but you're still family." I waited, saying nothing, letting him spin his web. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," he continued, trying to inject a tone of magnanimity into his voice. "I will give you a position, a small share in the company. In exchange, you will use some of the assets from that little farm Grandpa left you to secure a short-term loan for us. It's a win-win. You finally get a real seat at the table and we stabilize the ship. We can draw up the papers today." I almost laughed. A small share, a little farm. He was dangling a rotten carrot in front of a man who owned the entire field. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that even now, at the absolute end of his rope, he still saw me as the insignificant charity case, the history teacher who could be bought with a hollow title and an empty promise. He didn't see the man I had become. He didn't see the empire at my back. He saw the same old Liam he had been bullying his entire life. I took a moment before I answered, letting the silence stretch. I looked at Elena, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. I looked out at the vineyard, at the rows of vines stretching to the horizon, a testament to a legacy built on love and hard work, not greed and deception. Then I looked back at the desperate, haggard face of my cousin trapped in his self-made prison. "There's no farm, Caleb," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the unshakable weight of the truth. "This is an empire." Caleb stared at me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "It's a winery. Whatever. The point is—" "No," I interrupted, my voice firm now, cutting through his bluster. "The point is, you don't have anything left to offer me. There is no company to buy a share in. Grandfather's game is over. You lost." The color drained from his face as the meaning behind my words began to sink in. What do you know?" He stammered, his facade of control finally cracking. "I know everything," I said. "I know about the debt. I know about the mortgages. I know that the trust fund is an empty shell. I know that you are the captain of a ship that has already sunk. You just haven't realized you're at the bottom of the ocean yet." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The arrogant mask had shattered, revealing the terrified, entitled child underneath. He had never been in a fight he couldn't buy his way out of, and he was finally face to face with a problem that money couldn't solve. And no, I continued, delivering the final decisive blow. I can't save your company. I let him hang on those words for a beat, letting the last of his hope die. But I can offer you a job. He looked up, a wild, desperate glimmer in his eyes. A job? Yes. I said, my voice perfectly level without a trace of malice or triumph. It was simply a statement of fact. We're expanding our distribution network in the States. We need people. It's hard work, long hours. It doesn't pay much. And I paused, letting him feel the full weight of what was coming next. You can start in the packing warehouse. The transformation on his face was terrifying to watch. The confusion, the desperation, the flicker of hope, it all collapsed inward, imploding into a black hole of pure, unadulterated humiliation. His face, once so handsome and confident, seemed to crumple like a piece of paper. The king had not just been checkmated, he had been swept from the board entirely. He stared at me, his eyes wide with the horror of his own complete and utter defeat. He was nothing. He had nothing. And the person he had spent his entire life looking down on was the one holding all the cards. He didn't speak. He couldn't. I had taken his voice, his pride, his entire world, and with a quiet tap on the screen, I ended the call. The serene image of the Tuscan hills returned peaceful and undisturbed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The game was over. I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending and a beginning. 6 months can feel like a lifetime, or it can pass in the blink of an eye. For me, it was both. The Liam Carter who had boarded a plane with nothing but a handful of change and a desperate hope was a distant memory, a character from a book I had once read. The man I was now was someone I was still getting to know, but someone I was beginning to like. The land had changed me. The sun had darkened my skin, and the hard, honest work in the vineyard had built a strength in my arms and back that I never knew I possessed. The constant gnawing anxiety that had been the background noise of my life had been replaced by the gentle hum of the cicadas in the olive trees and the rustle of grape leaves in the wind. I was home. My Italian was still clumsy, a patchwork of phrases I learned from Elena and colorful expressions I picked up from the workers, but it was a language I now spoke with my heart. I stood between 2 rows of vines, the sun warm on my neck, laughing with an old worker named Fabrizio as he tried to teach me a local dialect. He called me Il Professore, the professor, a gentle ribbing of my past life, but there was a deep affection in it. Here I was not an outsider. I was part of the fabric of this place, my story woven into its long and rich history. I wasn't just the owner of Villa Rossi, I was its steward, its caretaker, and in a very real sense, its student. As I walked back towards the villa, my thoughts drifted as they sometimes did to my other family, the one an ocean away. I didn't feel anger towards them anymore, only a profound and distant pity. My grandfather hadn't sought to destroy them. He had simply held up a mirror, forcing them to see the truth of who they were without the insulating buffer of his wealth. The image came to my mind sharp and clear, like a scene from a movie. Caleb stripped of his Armani suit, wearing a plain blue uniform, his face perpetually slick with a thin sheen of sweat. I pictured him in the cavernous, impersonal space of a distribution warehouse, the air thick with the smell of cardboard and diesel fumes. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused, lifting heavy boxes of my wine onto pallets. His movements were weary, his shoulders slumped not just with physical exhaustion but with the crushing weight of his fall from grace. He was a king who had lost his kingdom and was now forced to labor as a commoner in the lands of his rival. Then the scene would shift to Chloe. I saw her behind the counter of a bustling, noisy coffee shop. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a stained black apron. Her perfectly sculpted nails were chipped, her hair pulled back in a simple, functional ponytail. I could see the practiced plastic smile she gave to customers, a hollow echo of the radiant, entitled grin she once wore. The boredom on her face was no longer a performance. It was real, a deep, soul-crushing weariness from a life of anonymous service she had never imagined for herself. They had been given everything they thought they wanted, and in the end, it had left them with nothing. I reached the villa and went straight to his study. It was my favorite room, my sanctuary. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden stars. The room still smelled of him, of books and tobacco, and something that was just uniquely Arthur. I walked over to the small table by the armchair. The chessboard was just as he had left it, the pieces frozen in the final moves of our last game. For 6 months I hadn't touched it. It felt too sacred, a perfect finished monument to his memory. I sat down in the worn leather chair, its familiar contours a comforting embrace. My eyes traced the lines of the board, analyzing the position. Bishop to h7, his brilliant final move. It had seemed like a sacrifice, but it was actually the key that unlocked his victory. It was a metaphor for his entire plan. He had sacrificed his American legacy, the thing everyone thought was his most powerful piece, to protect his true king, his true heart here in Italy. He had given up the illusion of power to secure something real and lasting. My fingers hovered over the pieces. I thought about the man who had sat in this chair, the man who had orchestrated this grand, beautiful game. He had taught me that the best inheritance wasn't something you were given, but something you were trusted to continue. He hadn't just given me wealth, he had given me a purpose. He had given me a family. He had given me a home. With a steady hand, I reached out and picked up my wooden king, the one I had carried with me from my old life. It felt warm in my palm. I looked at the board, no longer seeing it as an ending, but as a continuation. I saw the next move and the one after that. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about playing the game with honor, with integrity, with love. I placed my king on a new square, a quiet defensive move that solidified my position and prepared for the future. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. The old game was over. A new one had just begun. True inheritance isn't found in a will, but in the values instilled in you. It's the wisdom to see beyond the glittering distractions and recognize the quiet opportunities. The greatest legacies aren't given. They are earned through character integrity and the courage to trust the game a wise man plays.